All right. Well, thank y'all so much for being here. We're super excited to have with us today Michael Sacasas, who is a writer and researcher about philosophy and ethics of technology. And to give a little bit of a personal introduction, I don't know when I first started reading Michael's work, but I started reading it very earnestly around the same time where things really started to lock down in Richmond. And I can speak for myself and Eric that he has been a really helpful guide for us as we have, especially in the early days of as so much of life transitioned online and so much of the church transitioned online. A lot of his writings were really key to us as we were figuring out how we wanted to go about that. There were a number of times where Eric and I would be texting each other about something, and one of us would text something that we were thinking about, and then one of us would just text back, "Cicasas," in all caps, because it was something that he had already said a lot more eloquently. He is the author of the Convivial Society newsletter, which I believe, is that on Substack, Michael? Yeah, it's on Substack. It's really excellent. I'd encourage you to subscribe. But he has bylines all across the place. One of my favorite places that he has bylines is at the New Atlantis, which is a really exciting journal of technology. So with that being said, I'm going to go and hand it over to Michael. He's going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll have Q&A time at the end.
Thank you so much, Harrison, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. And I don't know, maybe it's worth mentioning too, I was a longtime elder at a PCA church, so also familiar with the ecclesial background that you all are part of, and currently Associate Director of the Christian Studies Center at Gainesville. I'm not sure if you mentioned that or not. So just to fill out the profile a little bit, but I have been writing and thinking about technology, especially with regards to the moral life or the spiritual life. And I'm glad to share some very broad concepts and ideas with you all. The general gist of this is just to help us think about technology from this sort of moral and spiritual perspective. So I'll do very little of prescribing 10 steps to follow for a happy relationship with technology or anything of the sort, but hopefully some of these concepts will help you navigate those kinds of questions. So one of the things that I like to do at the start of a talk like this, especially with a Christian audience that I know is obviously invested in questions of the moral life and spiritual life, is to suggest that one way of thinking about technology is as the material infrastructure of our moral or spiritual lives. And depending on the audience, I think this takes a little bit of work to kind of shift how we think about where the real temptations and the real challenges of our age lie. So growing up, when I was in the church, and even through seminary, I'm a graduate of Reformed Theological Seminary back from the early 2000s, worldview thinking was a really big deal. And it's valuable and it's useful, but I use this to illustrate the way in which we have sometimes tended to fixate on the concepts we have in our head as the key to sanctification or the key to progress in our spiritual lives or towards holiness, however we want to phrase that. And so in certain circles, and again, I have absolutely no idea of what is preached in your church exactly, so I don't mean to target this at all to you, but just as a general way of thinking about evangelicalism, there's a primacy of the intellect, we might say, where if you get your theology straight, everything else sort of follows or ought to follow. And what I would propose to you and what I would have us all consider is that while theology is clearly important and valuable, and while things like worldview analysis can be useful, it does tend nonetheless to ignore one important front in what we might think of as sort of the battleground for our souls. That's putting it a little dramatically. But if you go with that analogy, what I would suggest is that, yes, there are these important battles being fought at the level of ideas, at the level of concepts, at the level of maybe philosophy and apologetics. But then there is this other front that is also a part of this sort of battle for our souls. And it happens at a level that many of us don't put our eyes on very clearly. And it's what I am calling here the material infrastructure. It doesn't just refer to things like gadgets and devices, which is often what we tend to think of when people say, something like, well, isn't all this technology wonderful? They often have in mind the latest high-tech Silicon Valley products. And I'm going to suggest that we think much broader, in a much broader way about technology, and I'll get to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But that all of the material infrastructure of our lives, from the way that our pews are organized in our churches, to the choice between hymnals and screens, and to the shape of our cities, whether they're walkable or require mass transit, all of these have an important effect on the shape and quality of our moral lives. Sometimes the effect is very subtle, but it's real. And so this is partially what I'm thinking of when I think about the material infrastructure, again, of our spiritual lives. And so that's the way I want to sort of focus our attention, and then to sort of help us see how that ends up being the case, essentially by giving what I think will be a lot of examples that should clarify this place that technology plays in our life, broadly conceived. So I wanted to start by defining technology, or at least making an attempt at it. It actually is remarkably difficult when you try to think about what technology is to give it a precise definition, but I'll at least give you 4 ways of thinking about where we can see technology at work in our lives. And then there's one principle that I'm going to try to drive home, and under this principle, to give you lots of these examples to illustrate the dynamics of how tech shapes us. And the principle is simply this: technology is not neutral. When I talk to audiences like this, I say, if that's the only thing you remember about everything that I've said, if that's the one thing that sticks, then I consider it, a job well done on my part. So I'll try to drive home that point, and then talk at the end a little bit more specifically even about technology and moral formation. And I will say too, with regards to this idea that the technology forms the material infrastructure of our moral lives, that it is, I key that to, or I anchor that principle into what I think is a Christian view of man, a Christian view of humankind, which is to say that we are fully embodied creatures inhabiting a material world, and that materiality is inherently good, even if now it is cursed and broken. But that the material world is good, its structures are good, the relationship between the human body and the material world have all been declared good by God, and are not just a part of our past and a part of our present, but are even a part of our future, to the degree that we confess our belief in the resurrection of the body and a new heavens and a new earth. And so the role of the body, I think, is actually quite critical in framing our understanding of how technology impacts our moral lives. So having said that, and I'll do this. This is a small enough group, I think, where please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question along the way, or do the awkward Zoom hand raise, whatever you like, but you have my permission to just sort of cut me off at any point here, and not necessarily wait till the Q&A time. So having said that, defining technology. So as I suggested, it's tricky, and actually the term technology itself is relatively recent. It really comes into popular usage in the way that we use it in the early and mid 20th century. And so prior to that, if you were trying to refer to the kinds of things that we refer to when we use the word technology, you might have used terms like a tool or the mechanical arts, a lot of archaic sounding phrases that each kind of covered one distinct area of everything that we lumped together under the idea of technology. And if we just stop and think for a moment, I usually do is I just look around the room when I'm giving this talk and I say, all right, what's all that counts as technology here, right? Everything from the pen in my hand to the very sophisticated computing device that I'm looking into, the satellites that connect this device to you, the broadband infrastructure that makes it work, nuclear weaponry, agricultural technology, communications tech. In other words, we subsume under this heading an immense variety of artifacts and systems and devices and tools, some of which we no longer even think of as technology. There's one sort of quippy definition of technology, which is anything made after you were born, right? And so that kind of gets at the idea that when people talk about technology, they don't often think about their refrigerator, or they don't often think about a newspaper, or much less a pen, or even writing itself, which was a technology that at one point was invented with extraordinary consequences for human society. So I won't offer a kind of Webster's definition of technology, but I'll encourage us to look at it at four levels, in four different levels, going from the more concrete to the admittedly more abstract. But I think there's a value in seeing the technological operating at each of these four levels. The first is the most straightforward one, which is at the level of the tool or the device or the artifact, the thing that we can sort of hold in our hands or point to, and it's a discrete, concrete item, and we say that's a tool, that's a device, that's a technology, whether it is the pen or a hammer, an automobile right in front of us. These are all clearly technologies. They impact our lives on a day-to-day basis. We grow very familiar around them, especially to the degree that they've been a part of our lives for a long time. And they do kind of fade into the background of our lived experience. And so their effects become muted because we're no longer really self-conscious about them in the way that we might be about self-driving cars, because it's sort of the new up and coming thing that registers in a different way from the mundane tools that have already so structured our lives that we can't even imagine living without them. One level up from that, I would say, is the level of a system, right? So we have the artifact, the device, but then if we think of something like the automobile as a discrete item in our lives is useless without a much larger system that has been built up around it. Whether that's simply the paved roads across which we traverse our cities, the highways that span across the country and across the continents, the whole system of the production of gasoline, from extraction of oil to its refining to its distribution. All of these make up an enormous system of global consequence that upon which this sort of more simple tool, the car, depends. And then it begins to restructure, as I suggested earlier, even the shape of our cities. And so if you visited a city that took shape prior to the advent of the automobile, it has a very different feel and character from cities that co-evolved with the onset of the automobile and the development of highways. And so even the way that we can relate to our neighbors, the relationship of our neighborhoods to centers of commerce, all of this has been shaped by the automobile. And so there's a systems level at which these tools operate that then becomes a little more abstract than just simply looking at this thing in your hand and saying, this is a technology. Beyond that then, a couple of levels of abstraction beyond that, I would suggest that we can think of what is technological as a mode of thinking, right? And so I'll cite here, there's a philosopher named Martin Heidegger, whose name may ring a bell, and he has an important role to play in the history of the philosophy of technology. And there is one line of his that's certainly useful on this point. And he says, the essence of technology is nothing technological. And what he means by that is that you can't point to any one tool or device and say, here is the essence of technology, because it begins to spill out beyond that tool or even that system to shape how we think, for example, whether we have a kind of technocratic approach to governance. So how do we think about solving what are essentially political issues? Do they get transformed into engineering problems, where if we just have the proper method, the proper technique, all of a sudden these moral and political issues will solve themselves, so that all we lack is not virtue or virtuous leaders or systems of governance that bring people together in helpful ways, but rather simply a technology that will solve the political problem du jour, whatever that happens to be. So we see this, for example, in a lot of the uproar around social media and the political sphere these days. A lot of the talk centers around fixes like more fact checking, Twitter attaching little labels to tweets to indicate that they're misleading. And so in each of those cases, what I would suggest is that the sort of the root moral cause, right, the underlying problem is not really being addressed because we, in this mode of thinking, can only think about tweaking the tools in order to solve what are essentially human problems. And then at the far end, one extreme way of thinking about this is even coming to think about, as an example, death as merely an engineering problem. And so there's a growing movement that's not exactly fringe, even if it's not quite mainstream, where this is the approach, right? Death is not a kind of perennial part of the human condition, the culmination of a life, something that we prepare for spiritually and morally, but it's simply a technological problem we haven't yet fixed. And if we can only begin to think of it that way, we will solve death. All right. So technology in this sense is not a tool or a system, but it is a way of thinking. And then the last one of these is related to this, this more abstract idea of technology as a way of thinking, but takes it a little bit further. And I would say it's technology as a mode of being. And I think especially when I say this regardless of the audience, but especially when I'm talking to a Christian audience, I want to make this particular point clear. Because one way that technology has shaped Western culture over the last 400 years or more is that it has changed how we relate to the world and how we exist in it, our posture towards reality. And the way that I would oppose it is this way. It's rather stark, but I think it bears out. On the one hand, we are encouraged to approach the world technocratically, if you like, which is as a sphere for us to control, to manipulate, to put to our uses. In other words, in this way of thinking, the world we inhabit, and this includes other human beings we may inhabit the world with, simply become raw material. Heidegger, again, here uses the term standing reserve for our own projects. In other words, let me oppose that then to the other way of inhabiting the world, I would suggest, is receiving it as a gift. Right? So these are two very fundamental ways of being in the world, where one, it becomes a realm of human activity and ingenuity with the goal of mastery and control. And it has how shall I put this? It has the effect of making humanity sort of the masters of their own fate, right? We must assume responsibility for our health, for our well-being, for the economic order, for the political order, for human relations. All of it becomes just subject to mastery. And then again, I would suggest that we oppose that to the mode of accepting creation as a gift, human communities fundamentally as a gift. And the root, right, of our word for grace is grounded as it is in the idea of giftedness. I think suggests this very strongly. And if I were doing this sort of exegetically, what I would suggest is that we look at Genesis 1 through 11. And when we see the responses to the fall that follow in the line of Cain, what you see is sort of a refusal of grace and then also a refusal of the human condition under the conditions of the curse. And so Cain is told, for example, as part of his curse, that he will be a wanderer forever. And the very first thing we read him doing is settling and building a city. So refusing a curse, the conditions of fallen humanity, refusing grace, and instead seeking the repair of the human condition through what we might today call technological means. It's for that reason, I think as well, that we would see sort of the flourishing of human culture and civilization in the line of Seth, at the end of his genealogy, line of Cain, and finally culminating with the story of the Tower of Babel, which in many ways, the spirit of the activity in that story sort of adumbrates or anticipates the modern project writ large. And then all along the way, in those early chapters, and then in chapter 12, following the story of Babel, you have this parallel track, which is the way of grace, announced in first the line of Seth, culminating then with Noah, and finally with Abraham. And so you have these, and let me complete that picture just very briefly. The tower, if it suggests the Tower of Babel, sort of the effort to refuse grace, but seek out human salvation through human ingenuity, it is contrasted to what I think is a valid way of reading the text, the tower that is made for man by God, which appears in Jacob's vision. We often refer to it as Jacob's ladder, but I think good exegesis of that in ancient Near Eastern sources help us to think of that as the Tower of Babel, also as sort of ziggurat-shaped figures that have staircases leading up the middle. And so you have, on the one hand, the human effort to overcome the conditions of the fall and refuse the gift of grace, and then the gift of grace that is God's response to the human condition under our present situation. And of course, Christ goes on to tell us that we will see, Nathaniel will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man, just as angels ascended and descended on the staircase in Jacob's ladder, so that all of that finally points to the work of Christ. So that's a lot. I'll set that aside, but I think that that's a useful way of kind of framing this dichotomy biblically of the opposition between a mode of being in the world that focuses on human mastery of the world, control over the world. Creation becomes an enemy to be subdued. And on the other hand, recognizing human life, human existence, and creation, even in their frailty, even in their fallen condition, broken as they are, as fundamentally gifts of God, which then requires a very different relation on our part to them. So these three levels of thinking about technology, what I aim to do here is to simply expand the way that we might have thought about technology. So not only as the latest gadgets coming out of Silicon Valley, but really the whole material infrastructure that we inhabit, the systems that frame them, a mode of thinking we could adopt, and even a way of being in the world that I would say can be, in the shape that it has taken in the modern context, fundamentally oriented to a life that runs against the grain of the gospel. Now, none of this is necessarily inherent in technology itself, but it is the cultural shape that has been given to technology under the sign of Cain, if you like, right, throughout human history. So having said that, I wanted to then go on and talk about this principle that, I hope I'm able to communicate well, which is that technology is not neutral. This is one of the leading obstacles to thinking about technology, I think I would say, is the idea that the technology itself is morally neutral, and what matters is how we use it, right? And so the idea here is something like this, the hammer is a neutral tool. It just lays there, it's inert. Somebody might use it to build a house. That's morally good, presumably. Or somebody might use it to strike somebody over the head in violence. That's morally bad. The hammer didn't determine one or the other, and so it's neutral, but the action and the volition behind the action is really what matters. Atomic energy can power a city or flatten a city, right? The energy, the technology itself is neutral, and the way that it is used is where sort of the moral valence lies. So even sort of putting it that way, right, there's a sort of obviousness to it, right? It's sort of, yeah, right, that's the way it is. So what I'm going to suggest is that it's not so much that that's untrue, it's that it's incomplete, right? And so that if that's the only way we think about technology, we're going to sort of miss important ways in which it begins to give shape to our moral lives. So there's a wonderful line from a historian of technology named Melvin Kranzberg, who passed away several years ago. And he gave a famous talk, famous in the very small circles of historians of technology, called Kranzberg's 6 Laws. And so he sort of encapsulates all his years of research late in life and says, here are these 6 laws that I've arrived at to understand how technology interacts with society. I'm just going to give you the first one. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. Right? So it has this kind of cone-ish or paradoxical shape to it, right? But its technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I'm going to suggest it's a really helpful way of thinking about it. Very often, I think Christians especially just want to know, is this bad or good, right? And then they can sort of carry on with either using it or not using it, or whatever the case may be. And often the case is more subtle. It requires not black and white legalistic prescriptions, but it requires wisdom, and wisdom requires understanding. And so saying that technology is neither good nor bad, but that it's not neutral, invites us to try to understand how its non-neutrality shapes our lives, so that we might enter into a more faithful and a more wise relation to it. So some examples here of what I mean by the non-neutrality of technology. And I'll start with the hammer because this is such a an easy example, I think, to begin this discussion with, because the first point that I'd like to make under this heading is that um, it shapes our perception. Whether what we do with it is good or bad, technology will already be shaping how we perceive the world. So there's this little line about how to the man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so that speaks to, I don't think that was meant to be very profound philosophically, just an observation, right? And yet it speaks to an important truth regarding technology. And I think you can sort of test this out for yourself. When you have a hammer in hand, if you sort of allow yourself to think about how the hammer makes you feel, which may sound like a very odd thing to say, right? But a kind of analysis, phenomenological analysis of how the world looks to you with hammer in hand, you realize that it's sort of weighted on one end. The shape that it has already it sort of construes the world around us, not as things that we will hit, but as things we could hit. All right. There's a sense in which it creates a new relation to the objects around us, which are always sort of being interpreted by us as creatures in bodies, right? Embodied creatures. If we were just thinking things, this wouldn't register at all, right? But because we're embodied creatures, if you're familiar with Jamie Smith's work, I think he doesn't address the question of technology directly, but a lot of that same background about the importance of the body fills in the gaps here theologically and philosophically. Because we're embodied creatures, the shape of the tool is going to shape how we look at the world, how we relate to it. Now, again, it won't necessarily mean that you're going to go around hitting people with it, right? But it does mean that that may now be a very subtle possibility, right? There's a kind of invitation there that you at the very least are conscious of and may have to resist. Now, because it would be, I think, pretty absurd for us to imagine ourselves going around hitting people with a hammer, take the camera as another example. And of course, even to say the camera feels very dated, right? Because what we really mean is your smartphone that's equipped with these very powerful cameras. And you can repeat sort of the same adage, right? To the person with a smartphone camera, everything is possibly a picture, right? And if you sort of say to the man with a smartphone camera that also happens to have an Instagram account, then you make that even a more profound sort of transformation of your experience, right? So what is happening, again, is neither necessarily bad nor necessarily good, but the tool in hand, and the key point I would make here is even if you never use it, has nonetheless reshaped in a very subtle way how we perceive the world around us, how we experience it. And you can, I'm sure, multiply many examples along the same lines. One example that was sort of drawn very clearly for me recently. So I have a 5-year-old little girl and a 4-year-old little girl. And so I've recently gone through the whole, early childhood birth process and all that. Of course, not the birth process myself, but the role of being a father as my wife's been pregnant. And one interesting thing that I did not expect was the effect of that first. It wasn't a first, but the ultrasound to determine the gender of the baby. And this is, I think we forget it now, but it's a relatively recent possibility, right? That we have these very sophisticated imaging technologies that can, with a high degree of certainty, identify the gender of a baby in utero. And again, I don't mean to say that it's good or bad, but what I do mean to say is that the moment I knew that the baby my wife was carrying was a girl, it transformed the meaning of the experience for me, which is to say the technology isn't neutral, right? It has an effect. And even if that effect is not necessarily morally preconditioned one way or another, it did already begin to shape a very important dynamic of my experience of fatherhood, say. And so that's another example of how we perceive the world is shaped by technologies in ways that I would say are morally and ethically consequential. And this is to say nothing, of course, of the kind of prenatal screening technologies that not only sort of say, oh, you have a girl, but your baby has Down syndrome, or your baby has this genetic predisposition. And it creates a possibility. It raises a question. It generates an ethical dilemma where there hadn't been one before. And in that way, that technology becomes very morally significant. And that is before anyone has taken any action, unless we see the choice to have that screening done as an action itself. But the technology itself creates new moral situations that require new forms of judgment, that may require something akin to the resistance of a temptation, et cetera. And so the point here again is that just by shaping how we perceive the world, these tools become morally consequential. I'll move along a little bit more quickly here, maybe skip a couple of examples to make sure we have time for the Q&A. But another way that technology can shape us morally, it can have moral consequences. I think of our communities, our ecclesial communities, right? And I alluded earlier to the distinction between hymnals on the one hand and churches that might project the words of their songs on a screen. Again, I want to stress, not passing moral judgment here, but I do want to make an important point, which is that what happened along the way when we make that transition, and for the record, I'm at a PCA church that makes full use of screens and whatnot. But when you go from a hymnal to screen songs projected on a screen, two interesting things happen. One, the knowledge of music at the level of the score that appears on a page is lost, right? It's no longer sort of a default part of growing up in the church. And again, how you weight that, the significance you attach to that, mileage may vary, as we say, right? But it's not inconsequential, I don't think, at the end of the day. It's changed the character of worship and an important skill that might have been picked up along the way. Perhaps more significantly, what the newer technology allows for is much greater variety and flux in a church's hymnody, which is fine on the one level, but then it has some unintended consequences, right? And the thing about technology is often that it carries these unintended, unforeseen consequences. One that I would highlight in this case is that where hymns had formed an important intragenerational binding agent, right? So the songs I sing are the songs my mother sang, which are the songs my grandmother sang. And that united the corporate body through something very powerful, which is internalized songs and words and lyrics that are internalized, that are affective and not only cognitive, and again form a kind of intergenerational bond. That tends to get broken up, right? Especially to the degree that there's a great deal of flux within our hymnody, where from one year to another, right, the consistency of the hymns across time will vary. And so again, is it bad for churches to have screen? No, I'm not prepared to say that. Is it morally consequential? Does it have consequences for the nature of our community, the shape of our communities? I'd say so. And so let me give you one other example on this score, and then move on to the last point, which is about how technology, one important way in which technology is morally formative. The last one is the understanding of the self. And so I'll tread on this very lightly, because my understanding has been that you've all been doing some fair amount of work already on the issue of social media specifically, which is, I think, such an important part of how we think about this dynamic of technology in the moral life. But it shapes the self, right? And so what one effect of social media is to foreground the self as a performative entity, right? The self as something that we perform before an audience, and that we have the capacity to manipulate and to orchestrate, and that we become self-conscious of this, right? So one interesting dynamic that tracks with, especially the development of certain technologies of communication, is the effect that it has on self-consciousness, how aware we are of ourselves. And when we are sort of hyper-aware of ourselves, especially of ourselves as presenting the self, sort of liking certain things, sharing certain things, tweaking images to look in a certain way, so that we're always sort of conscious of not so much inhabiting our lives as directing them from above for an audience, for a variety of reasons, right? To receive the the affirmation that we might get from the attention that accrues around it. And then how that attention that we're seeking, speaking generically, obviously not for any one of you specifically, but speaking generically, how that attention, which is such a powerful driver of cultural formation, right? We are often driven in our actions by a sense of what we think the other wants of us, right? And it's one thing when it's my spouse, right, or my dear friend, or even a small local community. But it's another thing when that self to which we are bending ourselves in order to please is a nondescript audience that is algorithmically inflected, right, for the sake of compulsive engagement. And I think that, perhaps if we're honest, we might find that temptation, right? That we know the kinds of things that may garner a kind of reaction that gives us that sense of affirmation or pleasure. Alan Jacobs, who's such a valuable Christian intellectual thinking about technology, made the point at some in something he wrote that all pleasure, or excuse me, all emotion is pleasurable, right? So even if the reaction we get is sort of anger, and we know that we're just sort of trolling people, but that still gives us something to work with, some sense of pleasure. In other words, all this to say is that social media becomes an incredibly powerful crucible of the self. And my point here is simply to say that is going to happen whether all you do is post flowery Bible verse images to your Instagram account, or whether you're doing more illicit things, right? So very often I think, parents especially just want to know, is my kid, looking at bad things, looking at illicit images, and if they're not, they're okay. And I would suggest, well, they may or may not be okay, but you need to think about more than just that, because the dynamic, that identity forming power of the social media network becomes incredibly powerful. And I would say, especially in the life of adolescents, and maybe even all of us, it ends up in some cases becoming more powerful as a shaper of our identity than our local church, our family, our neighborhood, these other, what I would say, sometimes referred to as analog institutions that used to be the centers of identity formation, in many respects yield to the very powerful, ubiquitous, constant, always on dynamics of a social media platform. So in each of those cases, the central point has been the same, not to immediately say this is good or bad, but to simply say, regardless of how you're using these technologies, they are not neutral, right? They are having some formative impact on the self, how we perceive the world, how we relate to others, the structure of our communities. Now, very briefly, this last point, a lot of my thinking about technology does sort of stem from, what I would say is sort of a classical or medieval theory of moral formation, which is to say that we are formed morally out of the habits that we cultivate. And habits become either vices or virtues, and vices and virtue become character. Right? So our habits become extremely important with regards to the kind of people we aspire to be. A default example for me on this score is the virtue of patience. Right? So many of us want to cultivate patience. I mentioned earlier, I'm father of two relatively small children, and often requires a great deal of patience. But in various realms of life, right, we have this explicit desire to be more patient than we are, and often find ourselves failing at that. And so my question then is, well, what is going on, right? Are we simply not wanting it bad enough, right? Is the moral life simply a matter of waking up the next morning, gritting our teeth, clutching our fists and saying, I will be more patient today than yesterday? Is it a matter of some poorly formed theological assumption? More likely than not, I'd say, no, that's not what's going on. What is going on is that at every point in our lived experience, when we are given the choice to do something faster, we take it. When we're offered the opportunity to do something more efficiently, we seize it. And so we are constantly undermining the formation of patience, which would arise if only we trained ourselves to wait, right? And I would say that this has not only these sort of very practical implications for how we deal with our kids when they're getting frustrating, but even when we think about the place of waiting in the Christian life, the idea that so much of hearing the voice of God is a posture of waiting, of unhurried waiting before the silence of God, then an innate incapacity to inhabit the space of waiting because we've not cultivated the virtue of patience becomes a remarkably important element of our spiritual life and our progress or lack of progress in it. And where that battle, if you will, has been lost was not at the level of an idea. Rather, it was at the level of these micro practices that day in and day out, we thoughtlessly sort of just go along with, right? Always seizing these opportunities. Well, yeah, that'll save me time. I'll do that. Never abiding the opportunity to be still, right? To wait without hurrying. And so how we would cultivate patience then is not necessarily, again, by thinking harder about it, but by identifying places in our lives where we might choose against the grain of contemporary culture, which is to say, choose against efficiency, choose consciously against speed, so that one is deliberately cultivating patience as a kind of moral muscle within us. And so you find places where you can practice waiting, and you maybe eliminate some of the ways in which you're undermining that habit. And so there's always a sort of twofold nature to this idea of cultivating habits, which is on the one hand, you look at your practices, you find the ones that are undermining it, and you try to minimize them, and then you deliberately cultivate intentional practices that will strengthen the virtue that you seek. But the material infrastructure, that is the tools, the devices, and even sort of the ideology of modern technology, for which speed and efficiency are core values, needs to be understood and in many cases resisted. This is not, of course, to say that you always have to do the slow thing, right? Or you can adopt no time-saving techniques. But I think the example of Daniel in Babylon is very helpful here. He submits himself to this cultural flooding that comes with his education in Babylon, but he establishes one deliberate, I would say arbitrary practice in order to anchor and ground his activity, his identity, I should say. And I think that's a good model for us in dealing with technology. You cannot opt out of everything. You cannot opt out of the modern world. I mean, you can, but of course at immense cost, and it's not even necessarily what Christians might be called to do. But you can instill deliberate practices that act as guardrails and anchors for the moral life, for your spiritual identity. So habit, virtue, character, and then the practices that are sustained by modern technologies that undermine and inhibit us from becoming the kind of people we want to be. That would be the last topic I'd want to hit today. And so at quarter till, I'll stop and open the floor certainly to any questions or comments that you might have.
I have a question. So by your definition at the start about technology, can you tell us something that's not a technology? Or by the four categories you had? I'm just like looking around this living room. I'm like, by your definition, every single thing I'm looking at is technology.
Yeah, right. I would say every single thing is a product of human artifice, right? And the fact that we have such a hard time looking around us and pointing at what is not artificial, right? Artificial stemming from the idea of artifice, something made by human hands, something that is shaped and molded. The very fact that we have such a difficult time pointing to things that are not the products of human artifice, I think tell us something important. I'm going to take this example to make a point that I had wanted to insert at some place here, but I've lately been thinking a lot about the loss of the night sky, the darkness that allows us to see the starry heavens, right? And this is one example, right? We don't even, you can go outside. I'm not sure what the light pollution situation might be in Richmond, right? But there are many places where we might step out and ask ourselves this question: what do I see that is not, the product of human culture? and have a very difficult time pointing at anything. And I joked recently that we imagined Abraham being taken up by God in the middle of New York City and saying, "Look up at the stars, and if you can count them, that's how many descendants you'll have." 1, 2, good. All right, 2 descendants. But there's something very important here, right? Especially to the degree that we, as Protestants, we believe that God has 2 books by which he speaks, right? In this language that is sort of classically reformed: the book of nature and the book of Scripture. So natural revelation, special revelation. In thinking about what is not technological, what is not the product of human artifice, one way of thinking about this is looking at the created world, right? The world whose rhythms and patterns, whose beauty, whose majesty is meant to be a vehicle of the divine presence in our lives. And so when we have so built up around us, and I think here of echoes of the Tower of Babel, right? A city enclosed that strove for security and safety and found it in the encasement within human tools, a human built world, right? And then what we're sealing ourselves off from is not only the risk and the danger, what one might even say, of the fallen world, but from its beauty and from the way in which the heavens declare the glory of God. And so I have this pet theory of secularization, which is to say that it didn't proceed from philosophical ideals in the Enlightenment, but simply by the gradual electrification of the night sky, that in many respects cut us off from the leading indicator of God's presence throughout human history. I recently went through Dante's Divine Comedy and was struck by how often Dante references the stars as this, he calls them God's lure that is meant to lure us to him. So I've taken quite the rabbit trail to answer your question, but I think that the question does, one, suggest, yes, I do mean to say that when we think about this phrase, the material infrastructure, I'm thinking of the, what one historian of philosophy simply calls the human-built world, which is not to deny that it can be good. It's sort of common to hear Christians point out that the trajectory of redemptive history is from the garden to the city, right? And that's fine. Of course it is, right? It's not that we're not meant to build. It's not that we're not meant to use our skills, our creativity to transform the world that is given to us. But it is a question of how that is built, right? And what sorts of tools we create and generate and how it shapes our relationship to the world. And as I also like to point out, it is a city, New Jerusalem, but it's a city that has incorporated the garden into it, right? And so that we see the river running through it and the tree of life giving fruit of every season, yielding its fruit every season. And so it's not a sealing off of the human experience from the non-technological aspects of the world. And your bodies need that too. I will say, I will again go back to the body. We no longer time the rhythms of our day to the rising and setting of the sun. We have sleep patterns that are detrimental to our health. We have eliminated all boundaries to commerce in our life. Being a good Protestant, we should take the Sabbath seriously. And that's a little bit of a joke at this day and age. But each of these boundaries that technologists have broken down around us, I think, have created new impediments to the cultivation of a distinctly Christian way of life.
Michael, well, let me say, Harrison's right. We exchanged a lot of texts and emails. He shared your newsletter with me back in April 2020, which feels like 7 years ago. But so I appreciate your writings. You talked about creation as a gift earlier, and I actually pulled a quote because I wanted to ask you about this quote that you had from a newsletter. And this was in the context of parenting, but I think it's relevant generally. So it says, "I hope to both demonstrate and convey to my own children a way of being with technology which resists the temptation of a self-defeating pursuit of limitlessness and a willingness to receive time as a gift rather than an enemy to be defeated." And that one spoke to me. Whenever I talk to people about my struggle with, technology or whatever, I always think about it. And the easiest way to talk about it is like the list of podcasts that I haven't gotten to yet. and that like every day I wake up and it's like I'm just trying to chip away, like as if it,
Yeah.
it's just something to be conquered. And so it was interesting, using creation as a gift versus a creation to be controlled. And then I wonder if you could just reflect on the idea that you had of like time being a gift, because I feel often that I end my day and I'm like, I just sort of consumed all day,
Yeah.
rather than looked at time as a gift.
Right. That's such a great question that really brings us to a point. One of the things that I've noted is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? But I don't think there's ever a place in the Gospels where we see Jesus in a hurry, right? Jesus never appears hurried in the Gospels. In fact, sort of related to this, I noted recently that I think one of the most annoying things that Jesus teaches, and annoying that is to us moderns, or modern ears, our modern sensibilities, is not even so much the idea of turning the other cheek, which can be challenging, but it's the idea that you're to take no thought for tomorrow. Right? Take no thought for tomorrow. The evil of today is sufficient unto itself. God clothes the lilies; He'll take care of you, right? And what I see there is this idea that you just need to stop trying to control, to manipulate, to determine for yourself, to plan. Um, Going back to the question of time specifically, here again, right? The tools are critical. You can't count seconds unless you have a clock, and there haven't always been clocks, right? The very idea that the day is a set of discrete hours divided into discrete minutes, divided into discrete seconds, and if we have a stopwatch, into smaller portions than that, that it can be that it is possible for us to say, I'll see you at 12:13, right? That very relation to time, right? That capacity to approach time as something counted and measured and quantified, and thus that we relate to it as something that is constantly slipping away from us. One of the tropes of the kid that comes back from the mission trip is to say, wow, they came so late to everything, or they had, time was so different there, and nobody was in a hurry, and everybody's so happy, and then never quite getting that maybe there's a relation right between these two things. And the idea is not to make those people more punctual, right? The idea is to learn from them, because maybe that way of relating, not just to time, right, but the experience of what it means to sort of be alive in a day. Um, I had a student. I gave a talk recently, and a student asked me this, very same question. And one way of thinking about this is to recognize that when we think about our life in the mode of control and mastery, what I suggested to them is that we all do a very good job in reform circles, right, of saying salvation is a gift of God, right? Soteriology is grace-based, and it's a gift of God, etc. But then in almost every other aspect of our lives, we don't follow through with that, right? Salvation may be a gift, but my job is going to be a product of my effort and my striving and my ability to master the world, right? The health of my children is going to be a product of my ability to read X number of blogs about what the appropriate diet is for them, and the right feeding technique, right? I've been astounded at the way in which every aspect of child rearing has been reduced to a technique. I mean, many techniques, which then, whose partisans compete, almost violently against each other, right? But nonetheless, techniques to be followed. And you structure, a child's life right down to the minute in order to assure that they're, achieving at school as best they can, that they're getting the right ratio of free time to work time to chore time, whatever. Anyway, so the clock makes it possible. It creates a new mentality. I don't want to ignore the economic realities that also structure our lives and help encourage us to relate to the world, as you suggest, as consumers. I mean, this is fundamentally, it's a. I don't know how much trouble I'll get in for saying this, but you don't have to have me back. But it's a sort of techno-capitalist sort of mindset altogether, right? It's a mode of being that derives not just from our tools, but also from the economic structures, but from the image of what counts as a good life today, which is one where to go back to the idea of limitless, the good life is not one where we recognize these are good limits, and my flourishing depends on my abiding these limits, but rather limits are always something to be transgressed, to be broken through, to be overcome. Wendell Berry has a wonderful line about how we live the given life, not the planned. And he speaks about technologies in one place as, limits as in one place as inducements to elaboration. Right, that if we abide limits, we may find, right, the beauty of the dancer is only possible with the constraints that gravity creates around us, right, those limits. And so the idea of limitlessness, that happiness lies on the far end of our transgression of limits, the relation to time as something to be quantified and saved or lost, the inhabiting of the world in that mode of giftedness, where it's there to be received, right? Where our posture is not the seizing posture of the consumer wanting to take for himself or herself, but the open palm posture of the one who receives the benediction. These are all, again, important questions that are not just about technology, but upon which the technological structure of our life impinge, I think, quite powerfully. I don't know if that makes sense or if I even answered your question, but that's the stream of thought that.
That's what we love about your writing.
It's meandering awesome quality. Yeah.
I'm just glad that we can check techno-capitalists off of our bingo card tonight. Not to get too personal, so you can deflect if you like. You write, you think, you use technology a lot, but obviously, as you've talked about in your section on moral formation, you also think about habit and virtue, which actually it's really good, for us to think about that. We've gone through throughout Lent and Eastertide, we did these kind of corporate habits of centering and sending that were kind of, we wanted to say, hey, we want to have some habits to kind of structure the way, as people are having more vaccines, we're seeing more people come back into the embodied form of worship. We had these kind of habits that we all participated in for a brief season. But I wonder, for you, as if you wouldn't mind sharing, what are some habits that have been helpful for you as someone who thinks and uses technology like the rest of us?
Yeah, I mean, that's a totally fair question. I think one thing I immediately point to is, it's not so much a habit, but it's, I suppose, a way of preventing certain habits from taking shape. And that is that I just have a flip phone, right, rather than a smartphone. And I'll say too, every time I say this, I immediately say, I have that privilege, right? My work doesn't require me to have a smartphone. I think there are ways in which, again, not the device itself, but the system that has grown up around it, eliminate that freedom from some people's lives, which runs counter to the myth that technology always just generates more freedom, right? And in many cases, it compels us to do certain things we wouldn't want to do otherwise. So in other words, without implying any judgment or even the sense that this is what other people must do, it is nonetheless one thing I've done, because I would be wary of the kinds of habits that would form otherwise. So that's one way of sort of preventing the formation of certain habits. One silly example, I think may strike you as silly, that went back several years and kind of arose out of this, I think the first time I began to sort of think about things like, how do we cultivate patience? I used to live in Central Florida, and Orlando is sort of dotted with highways and freeways and expressways, all of which are toll roads. And so, I don't know, about 15 years ago, I guess, the sort of automated toll booths started coming into operation, and you could get a Sun Pass or an E-Pass. And so for a long time, I simply chose not to get one, which meant that I had to get stuck in line, right, behind all the people dropping their coins or inserting dollars or whatever the case may be. In other words, I was forcing myself to wait. And I guess a small thing. And I don't mean to say that was itself a virtuous activity, just like I don't think that abstaining from the king's meat was in itself virtuous on Daniel's part. It's just an arbitrary choice he made. He rescinds it later, so it couldn't have been a moral choice, or else we'd have to kind of accuse him of hypocrisy. I remember hearing about Eugene Peterson, who recently passed away, I think, and there was an anecdote about him, how before he would come up to preach, I don't know if any of you are the worship leaders in your churches, right? But oftentimes worship leaders want a very smooth transition, right, from one thing to another, songs closing, pastor's already there to preach or whatever. And Peterson would just sit in his chair after the song would finish and not come up right away. And at some point, his worship leader said, why don't you start walking up while we're sort of winding the song down, so that you can, be there right away, and we don't have that awkward silence. And Peterson's response was that he was teaching his congregation to be patient, right? He was generating a forced moment of waiting, right, of silence, awkward as it may be. And so I think that, though we can look around, our own, it may be something as simple as taking a walk, right? Forcing ourselves to, sit outside if we have that luxury and listen to bird song, right? The shape that these habits can take is varied. Tending a garden, I think is a wonderful habit, right? I live in an apartment, so it's not necessarily a very small container garden, right? But to be able to have my children sort of watch how something goes from seed to fruit, and that we can do very little to hurry it along, right? All we can do is tend it. But there's something valuable, I think, in that. And so anything that where we can sort of inventory our lives, and having sort of become aware of the kinds of habits and practices that take shape around our use of technologies. So then think about them more clearly and find places where we can interrupt the circuit, as it were, and stop the thoughtless operations of the technological system upon the shape of our lives. I think our unthinkingness is often part of the issue, and that awareness itself actually goes quite far. So those are a couple of the examples that come readily to mind, and I'm always very quick to say that I have habits I don't cultivate the way I should. I'm on Twitter too much. I sometimes think it was an occupational hazard, but by the same time, I realize I have a choice to make, and I don't often make it the way that I ought to. And you may be aware that there are ways of there are tools that sort of offer to lock you out of certain platforms, or even from the internet. And I'd say, those tools are good crutches along the way to help you generate the appropriate habits. But that might be something that might prove useful.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that you resisted getting a pass. Confession, we still don't have one. I was looking at my wife in the little thing here, and it was just my laziness, but now I'm glad to know that it's
no, it's your moral virtue.
It's virtuous.
Yeah.
Every time that I have to dig around for change on the ground outside of one of those stalls.
Yeah. You're thinking to yourself, I'm cultivating patience.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it is definitely, it's past 9, but if you need to get off, but I would love to, if anyone has one last question, please feel free to shoot it out.
I mean, of course, I love asking questions, but I don't want to take anybody else's last question. Chris, come on, you have to have a quick question. Chris, okay. All right. I guess just the bigger thing for me is just like, what are the implications for us and how we live, given we have all these things at our disposal at all times? Like, do we lean into, and even thinking like our jobs, like, do we lean in hard and say, I'm going to try to do everything I can to use these things for good? Or when do we know when to abstain and say, no, like, there is a power they have over me, and I'm going to do my best to just not let it have its power? Does
Yeah.
that make sense? Like, when do we lean in to
Right.
try to make it good versus stepping back?
Right. I'm going to give the most frustrating answer possible. And that is to say that that's in many respects, a matter, I think of it as a matter of calling, right? Of individual calling. I mean, obviously there's some clear, we might say there's some clear cases where, we might think of what a technology empowers as being, morally prohibited. But in most cases, most ordinary cases, it's not quite so clear. And, one can imagine navigating the use of a tool wisely and faithfully, and then also becoming attuned perhaps to when that may no longer be the case. And so something closer to renunciation becomes necessary. So there was, a few years back, and still to this day, I guess, there's, debate about what the right response to something like Facebook might be. And there was, a delete Facebook hashtag floating around, ironically, for a while. And I think Christians, especially, sometimes are conflicted with regards to communication media, particularly because it always, especially for Protestants who operate under sort of the myth of Luther and the printing press, that every one of these new tools is just a new way to proclaim the gospel, right? Making connections, et cetera. And so, and I certainly understand the pressure that a congregation may feel even to maintain, social media presences, and that there is this sort of internal debate that has to happen, right? Along the lines of what you suggested, right? Where are we able to sort of faithfully navigate the moral landmines, minefield, if you will, and when do we begin to feel as if, okay, we're actually not doing that as well as we think we ought to, or as we think we might, and so we need to make different choices, and that choice sometimes is just a choice of abstention, and of negation. I think at least has to be entertained. I wouldn't say it's not for me to make that call, for somebody else, but I think it's something that the individual, the family, the church, right? There are different levels of moral deliberation. I'll mention too that it's very hard to live in ways that we might think, reflect a kind of moral wisdom towards technology, unless there are others around us that are going to support us in that. Because very often, if one makes a decision to abstain from certain technologies or to use them in more limited ways, there's a kind of social cost that comes with that. I think, for example, even my children obviously are not adolescents yet, but if I deem it wise to not allow them a smartphone or access to social media when they're older and they're adolescents, it would certainly come with a social cost for them. And so, those are things that need to be, weighed. And one point I often try to make in these settings, which I don't think I've made yet, is that the point is not to see, the point is not merely critical. The point is actually about the good, right? What is the good you want, right? What is the true good and beautiful to which you want to aim your own life, the life of your family, the life of your church? And then how does technology relate to the achievement of that good? Does it undermine it? Does it sustain it? Is it in fact sort of indifferent to it? Rarely, I think, would it be indifferent. But then the degrees to which it might undermine it relative to the certain values that it might afford you becomes a kind of moral calculus that requires judgment and wisdom. But that we don't think of it just in terms of what do I want to deny myself, but rather what is the good I want to achieve, and in order to achieve that good, how must I structure my relationship with these tools, with these aspects of the world that I live in. And I think that those lines will take different shape, different patterns will form depending on the individual, their unique callings in the world, the structure of their family life, the communities they live in, etc. I hope that was, I'm sure that's not a very satisfying answer, but
It was really helpful. Thank you.
yeah.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much again. This has been, I've got several pages here of notes that I'm going to need to process over. But thank you. This has been so wonderful. And hopefully, who knows, maybe post-COVID, we can bring you up to Richmond. A city that has, to be so urban though, has so much natural beauty around it. So, well, and thanks everyone again for participating. I know we're all busy people and we all have too many things that demand our time on screens. So I thank you for choosing this tonight. If you would, let me pray for us and then we'll go our separate ways. Father, we thank you that you have created us to be people who image you by creating. And we thank you that to do that, you've given us tools. We do recognize, though, that the fall has complicated our relationship with them. So we pray that through the power of your Holy Spirit, you would guide us in all wisdom as we think about how to use them. We pray that your Spirit would also guide us as a community to consider what are the things that we want to put on so that we can strive towards the good together, and what are the things that we need to put off, the things that the way we use tools that undermine our pursuit of holiness and our pursuit of the true, good, and beautiful. So, Father, we admit that we are weak to do this. We admit that we need you, and we thank you that you will meet us. And so we ask that you would do this through your Spirit, and we pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. You have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So much.